talked about the patterns in general. The thing that I wanted to kind of emphasize is that even though we can do all, we can get to that end goal that I mentioned, even today, I wouldn't recommend going to that in one go. The first thing that we need to find out is how we can break or start building towards that model in steps. And I'll talk about the actual steps in a second, in the next slide. The other thing that we need to be clear of is that linear scalability needs to be built into our application and architecture. We don't have to deal with that in the first day, but we need to have a clear roadmap to get there. Because without linear scalability, we need to be aware that we're not going to be at the point where we're going to have predictable behavior in our application. So we need to strive towards linear scalability and need to have a clear roadmap to how we get to that point. By minimizing vendor locking, which is one of the main concerns, we need to be able to basically abstract the application. To be clear, we'll always have some level of locking in our application. We cannot avoid it, but we can manage it and minimize it. And the kind of tips that I'm pointing here is basically tips that will allow us to reduce fairly significantly the lock-in that we may have if we're not going to use them. So obviously, abstraction would be the main pattern. We can enable portability by enabling the application to be decoupled from the actual cloud provider services. We can enable it to host different type of web container. In the Java world, that would be Jetty, Tomcat, Glassfish, or whatever. We can design it such that we can interoperate with different languages. So choosing different languages and mixing different languages would be something that wouldn't require a total re-architecture of our application. We can also minimize the API lock-in. So obviously, whenever there are standards, by all means use them. But standards are covering only a small part of our application code in most cases, so we need to be aware of that. And the next thing that we can do to basically avoid lock-in when standard doesn't exist is use abstraction. Spring, I think, is a very good example on how you could apply POJO-based experiences and dependency injection to do a fairly effective abstraction on our code. The last thing is that you don't have to, if you're dealing with a new project and you're thinking about cloud, but you're not sure that that's where you want to end up, you can basically just future-proof your application, meaning that you're going to be ready for the cloud, but not necessarily deploy the application on the cloud. And think about how you do that for every new application that you're launching in your organization. And obviously, avoid long-term commitment, and that would be by the use of pay-per-use model and things of that kind. That kind of summarizes the steps that I wanted to kind of highlight. The step that I tried to highlight is driven by, it's basically a roadmap to the end goal that I mentioned earlier. So the axis that I use here is the effort versus the value. And I try to kind of provide a roadmap of steps on how we could get from one point to another, assuming that we have a tier-based application that is static, that is not yet ready for the cloud. What we can do to take that application, the same one that I showed in the first slide, and move it to a more dynamic environment. How we could get value from the first effort, second effort, etc. Obviously, dealing with the web tier as the first steps would be the easiest win for us. Because of that, we could move from static provisioning to on-demand provisioning, deal with self-healing, things on that line. Keep the database as is, statically synchronized, and even a performance bottleneck and a scalability bottleneck, but at least we can get rid of the static provisioning that we had at the beginning. And by doing that, we could be elastic to a degree. Obviously not elastic infinitely, but elastic to a degree in many cases compared to where we are today. That in itself is a big win because we can save a lot of the static provisioning overhead. And I gave you some examples for this cost saving that we can get out of that. The second thing is trying to virtualize our business logic, which is, again, doesn't require a lot of changes to our existing code. It just basically means that we could use some different implementation